This video discusses an article called "The Post Always Rings Twice: The Algerian War, Post-structuralism and the Post-colonial in IR Theory." The article is written by Alina Sajed. It appeared in the Review of International Studies in 2011. Sajed obtained her PhD in International Relations from McMaster University in Ontario, Canada in 2008. She joined the Department of Political Science at McMaster in September 2013. Her core research interests lie in the areas of international political theory, globalization and transnationalism, the politics of the Global South, and political violence. She is particularly interested in colonialism and decolonization, North Africa and the Middle East, political Islam, and post-colonial approaches to international relations. Now I will proceed to the article. The article makes a case for rethinking the relationship between post-structuralism and post-colonialism. Some others claim that the history of deconstruction coincides with the collapse of French rule in Algeria. If we don't carry out a critical analysis of the history of the deconstructionist tradition, we risk idealizing those who are marginalized. Robert Young claims that post-structuralism emerged as an anti-colonial project of resistance against the French in Algeria. This is because three influential French post-structuralists were either living in Algeria with the Algerian Independence War of the 1950s. These authors were Jacques Derrida, Hélène Cixous, and Jean-François Lyotard. Robert Young continues to claim that, in their attempts to deconstruct the subjects in our language, they inadvertently kept colonizing the mind. If we want to use post-structuralism as a tool to fight colonialist tendencies in international relations, we must become aware of and negate this historical irony. We must prevent that the practice of deconstruction redisciplines the so-called native as a limit of Western knowledge. At the same time, we make this native into the ultimate unknowable different being. Post-structuralism is useful to international relations because it shows a degree of difference in other peoples. It also shows the oppression of binaries, such as the East versus West, the inside versus outside, the colonizer versus colonized, and the native versus non-native. To Young, because of a too great emphasis on textuality and language in the scholarly practice of deconstruction, we leave out the role of colonial oppression. In the practice, we attempt to acquire an image of the meaning of language by filtering out the naturalness of Enlightenment values, such as reason, progress, and the Western notion of personhood. Nevertheless, Young maintains that even this practice does not make sense outside of Western history and Western knowledge. He writes the following:
If one had to answer, therefore, the general question of what is deconstruction a deconstruction of, the answer to that would be that of the concept, the authority and presumed primacy of the category of the West.
If that is true, then must we not pay closer attention to the colonial history of the West? I now discuss some elegant examples where the mentioned post-structural authors express their colonial view of the non-French peoples of Algeria. Derrida claims himself to be a Franco-Maghrébin. Cixous refers to her Algériens. They claim a certain post-colonial subject to themselves because they are neither truly French nor Algerian. Lyotard uses his experience as a teacher in Algeria to make political analyses about the country. We claim that they make an effort to make themselves appear marginalized in order to be able to speak for other marginalized peoples. Similarly, modern post-structuralists attempt to carry out their project to try to dismantle imperialism from within, because they can claim a position as both Westerner and non-Westerner. Derrida lived in Algeria as part Algerian, but spoke only French. We can infer from his characterization of himself as Franco-Maghriberian that he felt estranged from both cultures. The label Franco-Maghriberian is here not fused into one, but remains two separate labels. When I paraphrase, Derrida said that
I want to make the language come to me, forcing then the language to speak to itself by itself in another way, in his language. This desire constitutes my independence from Algeria, my nostalgia.
We must ask, is this an expression of defeat, where he adopted the language of the master? In contrast, Sissou desired a fusion with the idea of Algeria. He would call his father an Arabizara, his feelings a sense of dis-Algeria, or a Malgerian force of imagination. We must note that they evoke a sense of unattainability of Algeria for a Westerner. This is exactly the mystification that marginalizes Algeria in our Western minds. The post-structuralists admit that their mixed feelings of proximity and distance to Algeria formed a greater story about the why and how of deconstruction. But we must ask ourselves whether, rather than deconstruction, they slipped into containment. Sissou confesses the following in the opening of My Algériens.
The whole time I was living in Algeria, I would dream of one day arriving in Algeria. I would have done anything to get there. I had written, I had never made it to Algeria.
Lyotard would phrase it as the following.
Algeria being an absence or presence that always eludes the one that desires her.
From this, we sense an air of the exotic, of the mysterious, of the mystical, and thus of that which is to be colonized. Lyotard still makes a good point about his concept of the différent. It is a case where
the plaintiff is divested of the means to argue and becomes for that reason a victim.
Yet we see that Lyotard and Derrida are still guilty of this practice. In international relations, an author named Derrida makes clear that
it is a set of practices to deconstruct through detailed interpretation the inherited language, concepts, and texts that have constituted privileged discourse in international relations.
Analyses of post-structuralism and international relations imagine themselves exonerated of the task to be critical of their own assumptions, because their good intentions mean that they cannot be the colonialist. Derrida says of the Western view of Chinese writing systems that it is an essence of the name that we attach to the limit of the knowledge of a Western text. But Derrida impersonates that which he denounces. This is further shown in his effort to prevent scholars from treating colonialism as a collective process rather than as an individual process. However, by doing this, he also escapes the role that the collective has on his own analysis. He refuses to speak for others, he will only speak for himself. But in doing so, he escapes the responsibility of his own history. The Western critic grants himself the permission to narrate his own history, rather than giving everyone that right. The other, then, is framed as a barrier to knowledge of oneself. The refusal to speak for others makes that otherness radical, and it makes that otherness irreducible. One of the uses of post-structuralism in international relations is to expose subjectivity and to undermine ultimate claims to objective truth. Modern post-structuralisms fail to see the historical imperial roots in their own imperial conceit. which is the ultimate paradox of that tradition. With all the great scholarly post-structural traditions emphasizing inclusion of the colonized for 50 years onwards, it is still a reality that the voices of that post-colonial other are still lacking from the conversation. The tradition has been concerned with bringing to light other spaces of knowledge, other ways of being, other ways of knowing, and other ways of being in the world. But this can turn problematic. If everything is equally significant and if everything is equally contestable, then we erase the specificity of a subjective local experience of being in the world. Let us take a concrete illustration of this last point. Roxane Doty analyzes the role of anti-immigration laws in the West. She discusses racism and anti-immigration in modern France. She notes that there is a paradox happening there. On the one hand, France tries to be a nation of freedom and democracy, while defying cultural and national boundaries. On the other hand, France tries to be a nation of order, set identity, and security. In practice, this is made possible because France desires an inflow of cheap foreign labor to take up undesired jobs. At the same time, it is made possible for France to exclude those foreign laborers from truly participating in society. We must ask why we keep forgetting that the issue of migration in France cannot be discussed without remembering the role of France as an old colonial nation. Max Silverman even goes so far as to say that we cannot really speak of a clear break between the colonial and post-colonial eras in France. In fact, it has been formed through colonialization. This means that we can understand why France refused in 1993 to amend Article 23 of the Code de la Nationalité, where it refused to grant automatic citizenship to the children born in France from migrant families. It was in fact the North Africans who were targets of this. Those migrants were constant reminders of the French colonial history and were excluded from society as a result. Last, we discuss an example of an analysis that eliminates the foreign other in a slightly different way. Jenny Atkins wrote an article called Exposed Singularity, where she interprets photos by photographer Sebastião Salgado. She said the photos are intended to provoke a response from the viewer. Those photos are portraits of various children around the world. She compares that to a different photo series. This is a series of official photos showing mugshots of children taken in an infamous Cambodian prison. The mug photos leave the viewer torn as to how to feel about that. She says viewers feel like this because they have a need to respond to it and thus take responsibility for them. This puts the Western viewer in a position of power and superiority. Atkins suggests that such a photo exposes a feeling of self-identification for the viewer. The viewer feels that all barriers are lifted between us and them. The photo could have been us. This means that they are us. In contrast, we are likely to be sympathetic to the photos by Salgado as showing truly different subjective experiences. But we must never forget that the specificity depends on how a photo is framed, the context in which the picture was taken. We engage in a fantasy where, in our minds, we try to victimize a person in a frame. Then, in our minds, we incorporate them into our group, and then we make the difference between us apolitical.